So hope you had a great weekend and the best for you, Isaiah. Um, so this week we're gonna carry on talking about uh, some of uh, some of the challenges that Latin America faces, and one of them is, as you say, it is with regards, to aid. And so the United Nations actually create they were so-called Millennium Development Goals, through the Paris Agreement, so that they could somehow, you know, attempt to tackle some of the problems, but around the world. And that's when a big commitment was made, with a couple of countries. And the idea is that, to all countries get the right to be to have a democracy, they have the right to, to have a very stable structure, power structure, and better governance and transparency, in all entities and authorities that people could, get access, to the basic needs like water, energy, and so on and so forth, and minimize all the problems with regards to food insecurity, and a way to buffer, all the crises that we've been, experiencing the last few years. And we can actually even we are actually experiencing one right now with regards to the Silicon Valley Bank. Did you guys hear about it in California? About this bankruptcy? So basically, it was very was a bank that is located in the Silicon Valley, San Francisco, in the Bay Area, and they have a couple of branches overseas. And one of the branches was actually bought by HSBC. And right now, there was this fear uh, about the bank not being able to, to return the deposit that was made by the people. So mostly it's the bank that was focused on these green project, but at the same time it was a normal retail bank, smaller, but he didn't have all the resources and the money to carry on their business. So they decided to go to the market and to ask for more money, but then uh, the credit was actually the credit dry out, and they couldn't get it. So and then all the analysts was actually feared or feared that the bank would be somehow bankrupt if it doesn't get money. So when that happens, all the assets and all that the bank holdings, they are devaluated, and then people get scared. They experience some kind of hurt behavior and start uh, to withdraw all the money from their current accounts. And that's exactly what happened. It's been happening up until now. And then this was actually contaminating some of other banks, smaller banks, but still some of the big banks like HSBC or even Citibank and others. They might, be in a kind of jeopardy or at risk in terms of how it's gonna contaminate the market. So the government's right now actually analyzing a way to bail it out, the bank. So the concerns is still there, is still hovering, the whole population, but it's a crisis that that is gonna impact, and it's already impacting, for example, Latin America. And also, somehow all the currencies and the money market has been also being impacted by that. And the idea of the United Nations, it tried to create a buffer for it, not only for the big countries, but also for the developing and the emerging countries as well. And that way they create some kind of global action in terms of analyze the public health by giving out vaccines, by supporting initiatives in terms of epidemics, in terms of DST diseases that, for example, that runs from several that that has been a healthy issues in several countries, like in the Caribbean or even South America. And of course, this requires a lot of money. This requires, people being engaged, and of course, the idea is that the rich countries would help out for some money and make this happen. So they created what we call right now the development goals or development effectiveness. So it started back then in Mexico in 2002. And today we have the Millennium Development Goals that kind of tackle, these problematic by adjusting, all the poverty issues, or education, or equality, empowerment, and reduce child mortality and health issues with regards to pregnancy, and try to minimize the environmental impacts from production process, and other issues with regards to the whole let's say growth scheme. But these goals became the Sustainable Development Goals that right now encompasses 17 goals that goes from poverty until partnership. So I'm gonna put out a very quick video for you guys, just to have an idea of what we're talking about. So, oops, let's place it here. You guys can see my screen?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So here's the United Nations, development sustainable, the Sustainable Development Goals. So basically, they tackle 17 goals with 169 targets, and they had an accountable event throughout those years, and mostly in terms of eradicating poverty and trying to foment growth. They decided to take actions into zero out the hunger, trying to have a better welfare system, good education, gender equality, clean water, potable water, and clean energy, and somehow better infrastructure and better work conditions and sustainable communities and better production process, and also tackle some, what do we call it, the green economy, which is being a little bit greener production process, the blue economy, that the life below water, and the inland economy, and most recently kind of strengthen all the institutions and partnerships, with regards to those countries. So here's a little bit of an overview of the millennium. So in a nutshell, this is all, the track of those millennial goals that started out in 1992 in a summit in Brazil. And until now, they are trying to get implemented, for different projects and different guidelines. But that it's a lot of challenging, and somehow, some countries have more difficulties in implementing it than others. And just for you guys have an idea, this agreement between those countries is that, we have the donor, the figure of the donor, and the figure of the recipient. So they had to come to a common ground in the sense that, well, you need to implement it, but how? What is going to be, the counterpart, and how can you actually minimize all the impacts, from the growth that we are trying to achieve, and minimize how, reducing poverty, strengthen out, institutions, have a better quality in terms of education, and somehow also have an alignment which institutions and which are going to be involved in this whole process. They're going to utilize, the whole network or just some local communities, and how can you harmonize, and coordinate all those projects in order, to achieve those goals. And in that sense, they would create some kind of, key performance indicators that would, represent the progress of this country. And of course, this is somehow not an easy task, because we are dealing with some, a lot of heterogeneity, so different, different cultures and different aspects of, of life. But, some criticism against this type of program is that we are not creating an ad program. We're creating some kind of business arrangement, and instead of eradicating poverty, we are actually deepen the poverty, and instead of leveraging income, you're actually being a little being more unequal in both parts. So it's very good on paper, but very difficult to implement it. But so you guys could have an idea, those models are actually being questioned, and they are called, and those type of models, they're still running today. They call it official development assistance. Is a way to to find the avenue to reach the most countries that are currently asking for money or currently in need. And this is and the entity that maps out this type of money is the OCDE. So they are responsible for, tracking down, where the money, what was the purposes, and where, how much is going to that country, what type of money is going. Just for you guys have an idea, this is how they track down. So, for example, here's El Salvador. So they're actually updating the page. Is for Afghanistan, but let's look it up for El Salvador as an example. So if you see, the top 10 donors from El Salvador was the state, the Central American Bank, for Economic Development, Spain, Japan, and the European Union. So mostly comprises all the help that El Salvador has been, getting since 2018 until 2020. So the total amount for El Salvador is, roughly speaking, almost $1 billion a year. So they're mostly bilateral, money, and they are highly concentrating in action with regards to debt, because the country is actually suffering from some economic turmoils. They are also, related to social infrastructure, as you see from, almost 22%, and then we can say that education comprises 10%. So those are the most areas, or the most important sectors that this money is going to, so in order to help the country. If you see, for example, another one, that is Argentina, then you see that it changes a little bit, the donors, right? So mostly the money comes from the IMF and Germany and the European Union as well. So as you can see, the money are going mostly social infrastructure and services, and also for education. So it's a different scenario, it's a different type of allocation, so to speak. So basically, we can say that different countries have different needs. And if you go, for example, for Colombia, you're going to see a little bit different money allocation, especially coming from United States, from Germany, and from France. So they're going to infrastructure, and also from humanitarian aid, which is the most important money for that country, especially if they're suffering, from traumatic, storms, or earthquakes, or any type of problems. And if you see, for example, for Haiti, you can see that it's a big deal, because they receive, a lot of money, almost as much as El Salvador, and it's going basically to health, because it's still because of the poor, sewage infrastructure. People are still having cholera, for example. They're battling all types of diseases. It's still coming from the earthquake, and also from education and social infrastructure. And here is the total humanitarian aid that the country received in 1 year, which is at 11%. So basically, to help out, a way to help out the country to be back on feet. If you're talking about another one, for example, Peru, we're going to see a different perspective, because they are mostly into economic infrastructure, but most of the money coming from Germany, coming from the States, and coming from France and Spain, and a total amount of 2020 of 5 billions, which is a lot, because it's in 2019 was just, $500 million. And so almost, we can say that 5 times the money from the previous years is just mostly going towards infrastructure, a little bit of education, but mostly, also from humanitarian aspects. So this is an interesting overview of how the money is actually, how can you trace down the money in a way that is not lost, in translation, so to speak, or not lost in a way that you cannot have, you cannot have some kind of accountability for that. And one of the questions here is that, if you think about how, those money, how the money is going towards a country, but ODA is actually one of the lowest ways of money to get, to help a country to, to get back on their feet. If you see all those charts, you can see that, the most important way for a country to gain momentum is coming from foreign, we call it foreign direct investments. So basically, it's a company that goes into the country and that creates an industry and creates jobs, and those jobs creates income for their hire, and in that way that you start having what you call it a very successful circle. So this is a way, the most, as economists would say, the most healthy way, to create growth, and therefore to minimize all the impacts of an economy, of a very endangered economy. Yeah, but there is another type of money that actually that helps out a lot. We call it remittances. Oh, there is money actually from people that migrate and send the money back, to their original country. And this is a way also, to help the families and to help their, to have this family create a business, and this business will generate employment and so on and so forth. So it's a way of making this flux, feasible in terms of growth. Another one that is a little bit more speculative and people try to avoid it at some cost is what they call a private debt or portfolio equity. They're basically money from stock exchange. But the thing is, they are very variable. So they're kind of instead of creating stability, they can create instability, and this will actually put a country in a very, unstable macroeconomic, very unstable macroeconomic path. And sometimes we have to deal with those variabilities or volatilities, as we call it, so that we can minimize the effect. And that example from the Silicon Valley Bank is a way to, to kind of minimize the impact of a failure, of a bankruptcy, in the real economy, or in the real, or in our daily lives, for instance. So what you're seeing right now, as an example, people are actually drawing money and putting this money in a bigger banks like Bank of America or Citibank or even Chase. So that's a way of protecting themselves. So one thing that we can actually start, tweaking the idea, tweaking the data is that, is aid actually creating growth? What is happening in most of the countries, that are recipient from that money. And this is one thing that we can say until now. So the early impact, of aid can be very successful, but if you actually creating, if you're receiving aid in a long term, the GDP can be impacted in a much smaller scale than the others. So that's one criticism that people are doing, and that's for, as a, let's say, as a provocation in the third assignment that I'm gonna ask you guys, is aid helping countries to grow? So the countries that you guys chose in the beginning of the semester, are they receiving, first of all, are they receiving aid as a way to improve, welfare or well-being of the people? And is the aid actually helping this country, putting this country in a growth path? So that's another provoking question, so to speak. And this comes another, another connection between growth and inflation, because this is basically a problem of supply and demand. So if you have a shortage, or if you have excessive of supply or demand, you're going to create inflation. So if you're going to create, either a cost inflation, that is, if you have, for example, a rare raw material, and you need that raw material to start your, to have your final goods, and if this raw material is becoming very expensive, this company is not going to, to be less profitable because of it. What is going to happen is that this company is going to pass through all those costs to the consumers, so that the consumers would pay, for this increase of costs. And that's one way of creating inflation. The other way is actually when you have a kind of repressed demand, and this demand somehow encounters, a way to get hold of those products. And then, the vendors, the suppliers see that and start increasing their prices, because, they have much more demand. And by doing that, they are creating what is called the demand inflation. That is, consumption is actually fueling the inflation more and more. And this is what happens with, price increases. Just for you guys have an example, this is the rates of the postages here in the States. If you think about to send a letter, a regular letter, right, in 1932 was just 3 cents. If you go towards to this time period, and you see a little bit of the price increases of a letter, of sending out a letter. And if you reach, 2013, you're going to see that to send a letter is 46 cents. But today it reached 60 cents. So basically, from the most basic, cheaper, product, which is just a stamp, now you can see a little bit of a price increase as well. And if you're talking about different types of products, like, international letters, postcards, and so on and so forth, you can see the same movement. And this is what we call it inflation, which is a general, increase of price. When you have different price levels, and this is and this contaminates not only one product, but the whole consumption basket from this country. And who is responsible, for creating this inflation data, or for, for analyzing what is happening to the price? It's in the US, for example, it's the Bureau of Labor Statistics. So it's an agency that collects all the data and, putting together and analyze it. And so that is a raw material for the central bank to decide if the interest rate is going to be up or is going to be down. So measuring the Bureau of Labor Statistics is also responsible for measuring, the labor market. That is, the activity, if there's more employment, how is their work conditions, and how they, they can, how this dynamic is actually affecting, the whole economy as a whole. And by doing that, they actually go into the supermarkets, they do some kind of auditing into the supermarket, and also they go to houses, they make surveys and visit some houses to understand a little bit more about the market basket, of the consumption basket of, a general, from the general population. And this is actually what is called Consumer Price Index. So it's a way of averaging out, what people are buying, what are the specifics of that purchases, and if is the purchases is if people is actually buying less frequent one product and starting consuming another product in substitution of it. And normally this is measured in a monthly basis, but you can find, for example, cases that inflation is actually measured by weeks. So a week, in a weekly basis, and depends on the country, depends on the institution, because it all requires a lot of money to do this type of, of auditing or this type of measurement. So if you just go a little bit further down and analyze what is behind the CPI, what is behind of, of our, consumption basket, in a nutshell, it's the price increase of one period against the other. So basically, we are just, analyzing if one product is increasing by 1 year, against the year before, and see how much expensive and how's the percentage increase that happened, into that product. So roughly speaking, what is behind the scenes? What is behind CPI? So there are more than 200 categories, arranged into, roughly speaking, 8 major groups. One that encompasses food and beverages, housing, apparel, transportation, medical care, recreational, educational, and goods and other goods and services. So they try all, this institute try to map out whatever we buy it and how much we buy it, how frequent we buy this product. So if you analyze, for example, food and beverages, we're going to find how much cereal are we buying. The average population is buying it, the milk, coffee, chicken, or whatever you can find it. And also, if you're talking about housing, they're gonna analyze, the rent, the fuel, the heating, how much bedroom does the house, how many bedrooms does the house have, and so on and so forth. And that goes along. If you're talking about apparel, you're talking about, what you're buying in terms of clothes and transportation. How much are we spending, for example, in vehicles and fuel and fares and insurance? And of course, one necessity one necessity that is that goes along is also the medical care. Buying medicine, buying whatever supplies that helps you with regards to some kind of diseases or some expenditure in hospital, and or just buying medical prescription for a very specific drug. And also they're talking about leisure. So how frequent do we see TV, or right now the TV is actually being substituting, or actually they are less than TV, much more than smart TVs, right? So because we can actually see some stream programs like Netflix and HBO Max and whatever, Amazon Prime, and we are spending much more much more money and data in those programs. And of course, there's the other type of leisure that goes to toys, sports, and pets, and so on, so forth. And of course, there's education, communication, because we're talking to everybody. We are being educated, and we need communication, and we need internet. And this also goes along in our list of of errands, so to speak, and some other goods and services that that goes from haircuts to manicures, tobacco, or other types of of expenses. So roughly speaking, the CPI actually excludes such income and social taxes, and does not include, for example, investments, because those are considered assets, and they are not a daily expense. They are actually investments, and because of that, they are separated in a way that you can analyze it, but in a different perspective, in a different in a different point of view. So there's another definition about inflation that you call it core inflation, or core CPI. Why is core? Because we are actually excluding, or whisking away the items that are more volatile in a daily basis, that is food and energy. We know they're commodities, and those commodities can be, they can significantly, contaminate other prices. And that's why some central banks decide not only to analyze, the level or the whole CPI, but also to exclude food and energy services, so that they can have a better perspective what's going on to the price dynamics or to the price trajectory. So in that sense, how are those items calculated? So they are calculated according to the consumer's personal income. So whatever you receive, we're going to have some costs that that are packed to it, and you need to buy it for our own survival. So this is what you call it, purchasing power, right? So whatever we are able to buy it, it's our willingness to buy is actually that is affecting the purchasing power. If you are no longer able to buy it, then our purchasing power is actually decreasing, and that makes people reducing their frequent purchases, and therefore reducing the rate of inflation. So they create this kind of counter movement against inflation. So inflation rate, normally they are actually released as a percentage. They are between against price levels, in a very determined time period. And the thing that when you see the CPI and you see the core, sometimes even the core, can be a little bit higher than the CPI, because sometimes the food, food and beverages and other commodities, they are much more, they had a kind of, decrease or strong decrease at the period. And sometimes they overpower, the other increase. And that makes, the CPI less and the core high, the CPI, lower and the core higher. And this type of movement is actually analyzed by, by the central bank in order to decide, what's going to happen to that economy. So, roughly speaking, the Bureau of Labor Statistics, it's a very important agency, because they are responsible for, retrieving all those, necessities and everything that goes behind it in our daily routine. And for example, if you're talking about services, we are actually talking about, actions that satisfy the consumers, right? So if I need to go and get a haircut, I'm gonna go to the barbershop, and so on and so forth. So all those movements, they are creating, that must be reflected, or it must be reflected in the inflation or in the price level. So, and this CPI is actually determined by, weighing out every major group. So basically speaking, which group are most, are most important in terms of, of dealing with inflation. So normally they're services. Services, they have a huge impact, on inflation, because it's difficult. Once once you gain momentum, or you gain, if you need something and you buy even in a higher price, or you're obliged to buy it in a higher price, and then it becomes somehow perpetual. So it's difficult to have a step back and reduce price. It becomes, for quite a while, it can become, the kind of standard price, differently from, commodity that can go, up and down all the time. In that sense, what is the meaning of money and inflation? They goes, hand in hand together, because in order to buy goods, and you need money, right? So, but right now there's is money as papers. Is money as paper is so important as money as a virtual card? Are you guys okay with that, with that affirmative, or with that affirmation? Do you think that the money as paper is still more important than money as virtual, like a card or a credit card or a debit card, or an Apple, an Apple wallet or a Google wallet?
But it still plays a good part of our life. So I think yes.
Yes, exactly. Exactly. But believe it or not, so right now, if you consider all the transaction that is being, all that have been hovering, in the financial system, credit cards and debit cards, and all those, they're slowly being substituted by virtual money, and so that we don't have even, you don't have the necessity to have the, the plastic or to have the money itself. If you see the case of China, which is interesting, they use apps, to make all the type of transaction. For example, to go to a coffee shop, you don't pay the coffee shop with money. You pay with an app that is called, if I'm not mistaken, Didi. And this Didi is actually for everything. For if you want to call, a car, to go from one point to the other. If you want to rent a bike, to walk around the city, or if you want to buy beer or whatever, they use this app as a way of, as a mean of transaction, which is quite interesting. Did you guys ever have ever heard about Didi?
No. I did hear about other applications what they use like in China and Japan, like the same way that you said that that's how they use those applications.
Exactly. I'm gonna send out some links for you guys that is interested to see how, how fast they are, making changes, to this type of means, to this type of transaction. It's basically amazing, because we are talking about, the most populated country around the world. So it's interesting to see how they are actually influencing, other countries, to go in the same way or in the same direction to this type of, to consider this type of transaction. But there's one thing that that can be, that can be dangerous in terms of money, is that if inflation keeps, going and gaining again momentum, the inflation can be accelerated, and this can become what we call it hyperinflation, which is a higher rate of inflation. And then when you have some kind of, you don't have more control of the price trajectory, and it requires for the central bank to give a shock into the economy so that, it could, tame down, a little bit this rate. And this is, for example, is the case currently of Argentina, of Venezuela, and was, the case of, most of the countries that have gone through wars or have gone to some kind of crisis, throughout history. If you're talking about, for example, the US, he was highly impacted, in 60 years ago, and when they, when they had the Great Depression, and between, World War I and World War II, and of course after the World War I, Germany also experienced, a hyperinflation. And there's this photo from a girl just trying to buy bread with some kind of, those carritos. They usually take from one, professors, or everyone takes from one point to the other, or goes, to in the university, people carrying, equipment and so on and so forth. So they had to do that just to buy one bread. And this was very emblematic, for them. In the 70s, and, with the oil crisis, some of the most of the countries, especially those oil exported countries, they experience a lot of, inflation. And in the 80s, those inflations, this inflation became very dramatic, because they had a real acceleration, and they actually became what we call it today, hyperinflation. So just for you guys to have an idea, in Brazil, in the beginning, in the 90s, we reached 100% inflation in 1 month. That basically means that whatever, whatever was your salary in the beginning of the month, by the end of it, was worth nothing. Was, you wouldn't buy a coffee, for example, if you don't live it out into the bank. And that was very dramatic, for the countries. And right now we see, still this hyperinflation hovering, some Latin America again. And how economics, deal with that? They deal basically in understanding, how money works. And this is through what I call it quantity theory of money. So basically, we're talking about, open, wide countries that have exchanges from one side to the other. And of course, we are somehow contaminated in whatever happens in a very important country, or whatever happens to China, for example, we get the impact of it. And central bank also monitors, this trajectory of this dynamics, and they have, and how they analyze it. They analyze it through a very simple way, saying that whatever money, or the quantity of money that flows into the economy, will be necessary for them to, to lower or increase, the amount of money that is currently in the country. So if there's a lot of money, there's supply of money. If the supply of money is higher than the demand of money, they manage, to clear that out, by, putting out some instruments like bonds, and therefore they reduce what you call it the liquidity of the market. That is, they clean it up, they clear it out, and then they kind of match the equilibrium. If there is the opposite dynamics, if the money demand is higher than the money supply, then there is a risk, of course, of also of inflation, because if you're fueling with more money, you're actually putting more money into the economy. People will buy more, and therefore you have more, more inflation. So it's a very thin line, in trying to balance out, the supply side and the demand side. So why, and that's the way they think, why people hold money, right? Because it's a way to have access, to all the goods and services. It's a way to have an asset, right? But in the long run, they usually say that the money, or the level of prices, need to be equalized, by the demand of money and the supply of money. So somehow they need to find an equilibrium between the supply and the demand side. And that's exactly the point, because here in this chart, you see the money demand, as a normal demand curve, and the Fed will feed, the economy with money accordingly to this, Monday demand. If they decided to, to increase a little bit more, the quantity of demand, there's going to be a risk of your money being devaluated. Instead, if you're trying to, to diminish, to reduce the quantity of, money, then it can be the effect of your money is overvaluated, so it's a difficult way of, of reaching out, the perfect equilibrium, so to speak. And of course, this dynamics, if this dynamics keeps going, then you're gonna have what you call it, an inflation dynamics. And that's when they decided to understand a little bit more what is causing, inflation. What is exactly was causing inflation? So basically, when inflation comes around, they devalue the money, and therefore, whatever withholdings you have, or whatever assets you have, they're going to be devaluated. That's why people normally use, they deflated, the nominal variables, which is the current variable, so as to achieve, what is actually I gain from that transaction, or what is actually the real measure of my asset or of my withholdings. So basically, they are stripping out the inflation effect. So, for example, if I have an investment, and this investment gives me a year 10%, and I have an inflation of 8%, so what is my real gain? And the real gain is actually, the difference between whatever I'm gaining, wherever nominal gain I have, which is 10%, and the inflation that we are currently seeing, which is 8%. So the real gain will be 2%, which is going to be the difference. If, for example, if I gain 10%, and if the inflation is 20, then I'm actually losing money. I'm losing almost 10% of all my investments. So it's not worthwhile keep on those investments. You need to look for a more attractive investment, because I'm actually, my money is actually being devaluated by these inflation effect. So this is, most of this theory has actually been provided, back then at the, by Adam Smith and Hume, and they have been, the monetary economics have been an issue for macroeconomists, because they argued that all of those ups and downs from interest rate because of inflation will have a short-term effect in the economy, but in the long run, the economy will reach somehow an equilibrium. And if they're going to reach an equilibrium, then it's irrelevant, for analyzing the monetary changes for real variables, because they call it, this is going to be neutral. They say that, whatever is happening right now, they're going to die out in the future. And because of that, they're going to reach an equilibrium, and therefore the money does not have an impact in terms of devaluating or overvaluating our assets. And that's being that has been the common sense since then, and it still is for most of central banks. So basically, we are talking about what they call it velocity of money. So the velocity actually entails, the price level, how much our goods are actually weighted, and the quantity, the quantity which that economy is creating, that is the quantity of goods and services that this economy is creating, and by dividing up, the quantity of money. So when this velocity reaches 1, basically we are saying, look, the total level of money is equal, to the value of the products that I'm creating. Basically, it's the total amount, or the total financial amount that I'm creating. And that's when they reach an equilibrium. If it's higher, means that the quantity money is higher than my product, which basically means my money is more value than the products that I am actually producing. So I'm overvaluing my money instead of my product. And the other way around, if it's below 1, that means that my money has been devaluated against all the products that I'm creating. So roughly speaking, this very simple equation it's a way that gives some north, to all central banks when they need to decide on which level they're gonna put the interest rate, and this goes from any country that has a central bank as a monetary authority. So roughly speaking, just for you guys to have an idea, if you're talking about the velocity of money is good when it's almost stable throughout the years. This is actually from the US. If you see this M2, this is the amount of paper that goes into the economy, and here in red it's the GDP, the nominal GDP. So basically saying whatever money I have is actually being reflected in my GDP, or whatever wealth I'm actually creating. And this period from the 90s was the period that the economy, especially the US economy, was hit by all those debts, all those bankruptcies from different countries like Mexico and Brazil, and they had to to clear out the money, and therefore there was a bit of difficulties and toughness from central banks, to make the GDP, a little bit in this positive trajectory. And you see that there's a little hump here from 19 to 20 to 95 and 20,000. So this, and then goes back to normal. It's a little hump here, but right now we can see that everything is has reached an equilibrium. So, and this equilibrium reflects in the price level, and also reflects, in the inflation rate that we normally have in our daily basis. So, when we consider inflation, hyperinflation, when it exceeds 50% a month, and that is when the hyperinflation occurs, because it's a way that you no longer have the beacon, of your money, or you don't know how much money you have, or don't know how to weigh that much money. So everything is so expensive, and in such short time of period, and it's so dramatic that you no longer have a reference. And that's, for example, what happened with those countries that you can see. For example, Hungary in 1945, by the end of World War II, the inflation rate, this is the daily inflation rate, was 207%. Basically, there was not enough money, to fuel the economy. So, the time required for prices to double was like 15 hours. So if you don't buy in 15 hours, your product is gonna be the double. It's gonna be the double in a very short time. And that reminds me, for example, my childhood, because I was born in 1977, and when I was young, I used to go, to do the groceries with my mom, and then I would go, into the market and try to, to find the cheaper price, because I know the guy, the promoter, would go into the, into the corridor, into the aisles, and would put the price a little bit higher, because at that time in Brazil we were experiencing, 20 to 30%, inflation in a monthly basis. And then by the end of 1992, we experienced 100%. And this is, I'm not sure if it's exposed here, Brazil, but some other countries have the same experience. For example, here's an interesting fact. Are you guys seeing Yugoslavia? So basically it's 65%, in a monthly basis. So there was a time, when in 1992, when the Yugoslavia were actually were being dismantled, for different countries, and they were experiencing, higher inflation as well. And you have other countries like Armenia, Ukraine, for example, and Nicaragua, and Congo, and other countries that experience the same thing. And they try, here's Brazil, for example, they experience 82% in a monthly inflation rate. So even, and that actually makes an interesting effect, because whenever a money is so devaluated, the central bank sometimes is required to change, to change the reference and to change the money, the name of the money or the name of the currency. And then, for example, here you have peng, you have dollar, have dinar, but for some countries they have different names. For example, in Brazil they have cruzado and cruzeiro. In Poland they became zloty, and in Japan, they became the Japanese war notes, and today they have the yen. In Kazakhstan was tang, and then became the Russian ruble, and so on and so forth. And so it's a lot of, there's a lot of aspect when you change, when there's hyperinflation, because you change the currency, and the currency normally is pegged, to the nationalism of a country. Imagine, for example, when they created the euro, that France, that Spain, that Italy had to give up, their currency names to euros. It was a very difficult and traumatic situation, but for the great of good, so to speak, because the euro right now, it's very, it's a strong money. And when, but still, for some, for some seniors, they still do the calculation, for example, in pesetas, or in libras, or, in francs or Swiss francs, and so on and so forth. Of course, that there's other, impacts in terms of inflation that we call inflation tax, because it's like a tax, because you're being, your money is being brought by this, by these dynamics, and because of that, the central bank needs to print it out, money, and in a way that it kind of, it kind of charges the population, all the money that was printed out for that period. So, and of course, they have this myopic view, saying, look, you have a wage, or you have a revenue, and this revenue is worth a lot, more than, I don't know, 10, 100K. And if the inflation is 200% a month, then this is actually nothing, because it can barely buy you, groceries for the month. And so, but the government is actually going, they're going to tax this type of money. So you're going to be taxed by this amount of money. And there's this, this fantasy that that because you have more money, you're gonna get more taxes, but instead we're not. You're just, you're just devaluating, the money that, is currently, in the economy. Is currently, driving forces into the economy. And there was this guy, Irving Fisher, and they analyze it, and they create, and they name these analysis, Fisher effect, because it refers, to one-on-one adjustment of nominal interest rate to the inflation rate. And this created what we call it today, the real interest rate. So whatever, the interest rate is today, they need to be deflated, by the current inflation, so that you have a grasp, or you have an idea of how expensive is your credit, or how much money you are getting for investments, and therefore have a better, overview of what's going on into the economy. And that's, for you have an idea, the nominal interest rate that is currently in the US, for example, is going hand in hand with the inflation. So whenever the inflation goes up, the interest rate goes as well. And whenever it goes down, the interest rate goes as well, and so on and so forth. Up to, at this moment that we are seeing, again, another peak on inflation and another peak on interest rate by the Fed. So this is just, how much, how much costly the inflation can be, and can affect, our daily lives. Are you guys, do you see that when you buy groceries or when you buy anything? Do you see that, the products are getting, more expensive every month or every year?
Yes.
Yeah, so mostly it's we are somehow, dealing, with this cost of inflation in our daily routine, so to speak. So for next class, we are gonna, we're gonna talk about a little bit more, about what is behind those costs, how can we somehow minimize it, or ways of hedging, this effect from, from devaluating whatever assets, or evaluating, or increasing the liabilities that you currently have. So it's going to be both sides, the one that you're dealing in an investment way, the other that you're dealing in a debt way. And you're gonna see that this is a very important issue, especially, for Latin America. All right. Any doubts until now? No? So guys, this is the end of our class. So I'll see you next week in person, and wish you an excellent week. And then I'll put this record in the, in Canvas, so that you can just, look again if you have any doubts, but you can also reach me, through email. And yes, for this third assignment, I'm gonna send you guys just a PDF with those questions, and so you can brainstorm a little bit more. All right. So see you next week. Thank you.
Thank you.